that beat.
I drop beliefs, and when they carve my name inside the concrete, I pray it forever. Freedom, freedom, I can't move. Freedom, cut me loose. Yeah. Freedom, freedom, where are you? 'Cause I need freedom too. I break chains all by myself. Won't let my freedom rot in hell. Hey, I'ma keep on running 'cause a winner don't quit on themselves. What you want from me? Is it true? You see, I'm father getting there. What you want from me? Is it true? You see, I'm father getting there. Getting there.
Don't punish me with brutality. Talk to me so you can see what's going on. What's going on? Yeah, what's going on? Oh, what's going on? Right now.
Ice, water frozen solid. ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. ICE, el hielo.
Va pasando el trapo sobre la mesa y está cuidando que todo brille como una perla. Cuando llegue la patrona, que no se vuelva a quejar, no sea cosa que la acuse de ilegal. José atiende los jardines, parece de...
All you gotta do is see the world with new eyes.
Immigrants, we get the job done.
Look how far I come. Look how far I come. Look how far I come.
We get the job done.
Look how far I come. Look how far I come. Look how far I come.
Immigrants, we get the job done.
It's a hard line when you're an import, baby boy. It's hard times when you ain't sent for races.
Texas y Utah y California, Wyoming y Colorado, Nevada, Nuevo México, todas estas tierras fueron robadas. Y al presente nos encontramos rogándole al gobierno. Reyes, López.
Yeah, Lord, Lord, Lord. Once we did, we shall overcome. One day, we shall overcome. One day, we shall overcome. The Lord one day. Yeah, 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 yeah. If in our heart we do believe, Lord, we shall overcome. Lord, one day. We shall all have it,
But I'm afraid to die, 'cause I don't know what's up there beyond the sky. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes it will. One day, glory comes, it will be ours, it will be ours. Oh, one day, when the war is won, we will be sure, we
hands to the heavens, no man, no weapon formed against, yes, glorious destiny. Every day,
gotta give us what we need. Hey, our freedom of speech is freedom of death. We got to fight the powers that be. Fight the power. 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 We got to fight the powers that be.
Reason why y'all beliefs, and when they carve my name inside the concrete, I pray it forever.
Freedom, freedom, I can't move. Freedom, cut me loose. Yeah. Freedom, freedom, where are you? 'Cause I need freedom too. I break chains all by myself. Won't let my freedom rot in hell. Hey, I'ma keep on running 'cause a winner don't quit on themselves.
What you want from me? Is it true? You see, I'll father get in there. What you want from me? Is it true? You see, I'll father get in there. In there.
Don't punish me with brutality. Talk to me so you can see what's going on. What's going on? Yeah, what's going on? Oh, what's going on? Right on.
Ice, water frozen solid. ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. ICE, el hielo.
Eva pasando el trapo sobre la mesa y está cuidando que todo brille como una perla. Cuando llegue la patrona, que no se vuelva a quejar, no sea cosa que la acuse de ilegal. José atiende los jardines, parece
all you gotta do is see the world with new eyes.
Immigrants, we get the job done.
Look how far I come. Look how far I come. Look how far I come.
We get the job done.
Look how far I come. Look how far I come. Look how far I come.
Immigrants, we get the job done.
It's a hard line when you're an import, baby boy. It's hard times when you ain't sent for raising for the belly.
Texas y Utah y California, Wyoming y Colorado, Nevada, Nuevo México, todas estas tierras fueron robadas. Y al presente nos encontramos rogándole al gobierno. Reyes, López,
Yeah, Lord, Lord, Lord. Once we did, we shall overcome. One day, we shall overcome. One day, we shall overcome. The Lord one day. Yeah, 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 yeah. If in our heart we do believe, Lord, we shall overcome. Lord, one day. We shall all have
but I'm afraid to die. 'Cause I don't know what's up there beyond the sky. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes it will.
One day, when the glory comes, it will be ours. It will be ours. Oh, one day.
Good evening. My name is Kofi Lomote. I am a faculty member at Western Carolina University. And for the next 24 hours, I'm the chair of the Social Justice Action Committee. The Social Justice in Education Award honors individuals who have had an extraordinary impact on social justice by producing and/or applying education research to policy and/or practice. I can think of no one who fits this description in the field of education today more so than Dr. Estela Mara Bensimon, professor at the Rosier School of Education. Professor Bensimon is a professor at the Rosier School of Education at the University of Southern California and director of USC's Center for Urban Education. Through the center, which she founded in 1999, she has worked with thousands of college professionals, from presidents to faculty to academic counselors, helping them take steps in their daily work to reverse the impact of the historical and structural disadvantages that prevent many students of color from excelling in higher education. The center builds upon this premise by developing tools and processes that empower these professionals as researchers into their own practices with the ultimate goal of not just marginal changes in policy or practice, but shifts on those campuses toward cultures of inclusion and broad ownership over racial equality. The center is regarded as an intellectually vibrant enterprise that does theoretically sophisticated and methodologically rigorous research, ultimately leading to institutional change. Professor Bensimon earned her master's degree from Montclair State University in Student Personnel Services and her doctorate from Teachers College at Columbia University in Higher Education. She was Associate Dean of the USC Rosier School of Education from 1996 until the year 2000, and was the recipient of a Fulbright Scholarship in Mexico in 2002. Dr. Bensimon has been president of the Association for the Study of Higher Education and vice president of AERA's Division of Post-Secondary Education. In 2011, she was inducted as an AERA Fellow in recognition of her excellence in research. She is also the recipient of USC's Mellon Award for Excellence in Mentoring, the University of Wisconsin's Outstanding Women of Color in Education Award, and the Association for the Study of Higher Education's Distinguished Service Award. With the impact of her contributions to the national discussions on racial equality and human rights, and more importantly, on the implementation of equitable policies and practices, Dr. Bensimon has furthered the cause of social justice through her scholarship, including action research with college and university faculty and leaders, peer and student mentoring, service to the field, and policy analysis. Dr. Bensimon's commitment to social justice is particularly evident in her application of knowledge on organizational learning, leadership, and equity on the ground at colleges and universities in several states. Her current research is on issues of racial equity in higher education from the perspective of organizational learning and socio-cultural practical theories. She is particularly interested in practitioner-driven inquiry as a means of organizational change in higher education. She focuses on increasing equity in higher education outcomes for students of color. Relatedly, she developed the Equity Scorecard, a process for using inquiry to drive changes in institutional practices and culture. The innovative Equity Scorecard process takes a strengths-based approach, starting from the premise that faculty and administrators are committed to doing the good. She devised the Equity Scorecard for encouraging leaders at institutions to locate disparities using disaggregated data on student success and to engage in conversations that could lead to change. Through the self-examination process, many diverse institutions were forced to acknowledge that while they were good at enrolling a diverse student population, the lack of attention to closing attainment gaps served to reinforce inequitable career outcomes. Several institutions now credit the process initiated with the Equity Scorecard as significant in helping them close attainment gaps. The tool is now more regularly used in community colleges, Hispanic-serving institutions, and predominantly white campuses across the nation as one method of improving institutional performance and pursuing campus diversity initiatives. Dr. Bensimon and her team at the center have spent much of their time over the last decade working directly with campuses to improve their performance. Her work has had a great impact on changing practices from data storage to data usage and targeting areas for organizational and social change. National higher education associations have turned to Dr. Bensimon for her expertise in educating faculty and institutional leaders on how to address equity issues on college campuses. With publications appearing in the Review of Higher Education, the Journal of Higher Education, Liberal Education, and Harvard Educational Review, Dr. Bensimon has also made significant scholarly contributions to the field, focusing on equity, organizational learning, practitioner inquiry, and change. In her 2007 article on the underestimated significance of practitioner knowledge in the scholarship on student success, which was the focus of her presidential address for the Association for the Study of Higher Education, she pointed out how major research in the field undervalues these perspectives. She draws from years of engaged research at many levels with practitioners to advance equity and empower them to use research as change agents within their particular contexts. Most recently, Dr. Bensimon has been writing on critical perspectives to advance the field of higher education research and the notion of equity-minded scholarship. Her most recent books include Critical Approaches to the Study of Higher Education, co-edited with Anna Martinez-Aliman and Brian Pusser. This edited book recently won the AERA Division J Outstanding Publication of the Year Award. The volume will contribute to advancing critical perspectives in higher education research for many years to come. Some of her additional publications include Engaging the Race Question, Accountability and Equity in U.S. Higher Education with Alicia C. Dowd, and Confronting Equity Issues on Campus, Implementing the Equity Scorecard in Theory and Practice, co-edited with Lindsay Malcolm. How we conduct research, our paradigms and approaches matter significantly in addressing social justice issues in education. Dr. Bensimon has applied feminist perspectives and critical post-structuralist perspectives throughout her career and has been a pioneer when it comes to understanding leadership and management in higher education. Please stand and join me in welcoming the 2017 Social Justice and Education Lecturer, Dr. Estela Mara Bensimon.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that introduction, Kofi. It was just so generous. I'm also very grateful to the Social Justice Action Committee for selecting me as a 2017 award recipient. As some of you may know, I was the chair of SJAC just before Kofi's appointment, and I had the honor of presiding over the lectures given by Jeannie Oakes, who is here, Michael Olivas, and Gloria Ladson-Billings. Being put in the role of the one giving the lecture came, of course, as a great surprise, and it is one of the most meaningful affirmations of the work that I and my colleagues at the Center for Urban Education have been doing since 1999. I want to give a special warm shout out to Alicia Dowd, who until recently served as CUE's co-director, and to Dr. Lindsay Malcolm PQ, who since joining CUE about a year ago has become a great partner and role model for all of us. Alicia and Lindsay were not able to join us here today, but I think that they're watching the live stream, probably with drinks in their hands. I also want to acknowledge my mother, Maria Bensimon, for having had the wisdom to convince my father in 1962 to move to the United States. Even though I was not particularly happy about the move, I realized that if I had stayed in Argentina, in the very small town where we lived in Patagonia, during the first 12 years of my life, I would not be here today, and I would not have the academic career that I have been so fortunate and privileged to enjoy. Had I known this in 1962, I would have not been so rebellious. I am saying this for the benefit of my 93-year-old mother, who I think is tuned into the lecture. The work of academics is often portrayed as solitary and highly individualized. But as I show in this slide, I have been fortunate to have many wonderful colleagues and mentors, as well as the inspiration from the work of other scholars, among them Angela Valenzuela, Gloria Ladson-Billings, James Banks, and Jeannie Oakes, and many more. And I am grateful for both Jeannie and James being here with me. With this collage of scholars' images, I want to make the point that I did not get here all by myself. I was lucky to have great company throughout my career. And there are many more I can think of who belong in this slide. Among them, my very smart and hardworking students, some of them who are here, Adrian Trinidad, Maxine Roberts, and Eric Felix. And the many practitioners throughout California, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Nevada, and Colorado, who have partnered with the Center for Urban Education and have taught me so much about how to apply the methods of critical action research to make racial equity an academic reality. I also want to thank members of the center who worked on the technical details of the music tape that you heard, as well as my slides, Elizabeth Kanofsky, Emily Ogle, and Eric Felix. And I'm also grateful to Paloma Sanz, my administrative assistant, and Reynaldo Baca for serving as musical advisors. Most of all, I want to thank Agapito Diaz, my beautiful, generous, smart, and above all, selfless partner of 30 years, who has made my life full of love and fun, always accompanied with great food, exquisite wines, and perfectly made Negronis. Thank you, Agapito, for putting up with me for so many years. A few moments ago, you heard Marvin Gaye's beautiful voice asking, "What is going on? What is going on?" Marvin Gaye sang that in the 1960s to raise consciousness about the evils of war and racism. Now, in 2017, what is going on is the question that runs through my mind with varying levels of urgency every day, and I am sure it runs through many of your minds each day as well. It seemed very fitting to me then to make that question also run through this lecture, which is titled, Making American Higher Education Just. In preparing this lecture, I debated how to best approach the topic of justice and injustice in higher education. There are numerous historical touchstones I could have used as a starting point, as well as a number of my own personal experiences and the experiences of colleagues, students, and the many people whose stories I have documented in articles and books. But here's the starting point for me. Making higher education just requires equity-minded practitioners and researchers, as well as philanthropists and intermediary organization leaders, all of them working together, believing jointly in the need for justice in education and in the essential value of racial equity. This means having a shared understanding of the characteristics of equity-mindedness. For me, equity-mindedness means being race-conscious in a critical way as opposed to colorblind, being cognizant of how racism is produced through everyday practices, and having the courage to make racism visible and discussable. Equity-mindedness as a way of seeing and acting has been the ideal that I and my colleagues at the Center for Urban Education have been working towards since our founding. To put equity-mindedness into the most contemporary context of higher education and within the theme of making higher education just, I will talk today, very frankly, about the techno-rational solutions that are trending as part of the college completion agenda in the United States and the startling invisibility of race and racism in those so-called solutions. I am using the term techno-rational to describe structural solutions, sometimes referred to as game changers, that overlook not only the complexity of community colleges, but also the racialized nature of community colleges. In particular, I am asking, what is going on to bring attention to the prevalence of racial invisibility in techno-rational solutions aimed at reforming the most urgent problems being confronted by community colleges? I say this with full awareness that portraying community colleges as racialized is not the way we usually talk about higher education. In fact, race and racism as characteristics of higher education are typically absent from mainstream depictions of higher education. As long as we say nothing about the silencing of race, and I am including whiteness here, it will continue to happen. Thus, it is important that those of us, like me, who are given the opportunity to speak publicly, that we use that privilege in the interest of justice. This has never been more true than it is in our country right now. No matter who you are or where you are in your career or your scholarship. One of the first books that I read as a beginning doctoral student at Teachers College higher education program when I was a doctoral student was Joseph Ben-David's Trends in American Education, Higher Education. Even though I read that book in a different century, more decades ago than I prefer to calculate, to this day I recall Ben-David's depiction of our system as egalitarian. Instead of seeing a highly stratified system of higher education, Ben-David saw a system that was integrated by a tiered structure that he assumed may transfer from one institution to another and from a lower sector to a higher sector, a natural and smooth process. Ben-David's focus on the structural organization of higher education made him see a rational distribution of labor by sector and institutional types that from the outside appear fair, egalitarian, and free of racial discrimination. He singled out for special praise the transfer opportunities available at that time to junior college students. In contrast to Ben-David, contemporary philosophers, scholars of education, and sociologists, prominent among them Lionel McPherson, Sean Harper, Greg Anderson, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, Ana Martinez Alemán, Silvia Hurtado, Laura Rendon, Lori Patton, Danny Solorzano, Tara Yoso, Mitch Chang, Rob Ternishi, and many more point to a system of higher education that is sustained by structures, policies, and practices that manufacture racial inequality. Where mainstream white scholars see a higher education system that is adaptive to all kinds of students, critical scholars of color see and call attention to the production of racial inequality. Where mainstream white scholars and policymakers think in non-racial terms about structures, policies, and practices, as well as people, critical scholars of color assume an analytical orientation that accepts racism as endemic to higher education. Where mainstream white scholars see structure as a means of bringing order to disorder, critical scholars of color see a racial structure paired with a discourse of whiteness that must be dismantled. However, as I will discuss further, this critical voice of scholars of color is invisible in the national reforms that propose to support the college completion agenda, particularly as applied to community colleges. I realize that when I call for the visibility of race and for the capacity to understand race critically, I have something in mind that may not be self-evident to everyone. First, as a caveat, I do recognize and accept that race is a socially constructed category. However, as Eduardo Bonilla Silva points out, race is socially constructed, but it also has a social reality, meaning that it produces real effects on the actors racialized as Black or white. In my work with colleges, it is not unusual to be asked, why do you focus on race? Or to hear people assert, I don't see race, I just see people. I also hear that since race is not a biological fact, we should not try to observe, for instance, the quality of classroom interactions between instructors and students who are not white. So believe me when I tell you that I am aware that noticing race based on skin color or other physical characteristics is imperfect. But I also know that refusing to see race or to pretend that it does not exist will not make racism go away. K. Anthony Appiah cautions us that to talk about race intelligently, we must be clear about what we mean. In this lecture, I'm using the term race as a signifier, a label that refers to people who have experienced oppression and who share a history of oppression. I am using race to make the point that black and white circumscribe the social realities of scholars, funders, policymakers, leaders, instructors, staff, and students. Black and white are present even when they are not explicitly named. I use race in reference to Black Americans, Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, American Indians, Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders, because they share a history of oppression based on assumptions that color and other physical characteristics, as well as language, are markers of inferiority that justified subjugation, exclusion, and discrimination. Though I use the term race to encompass communities with distinct experiences of oppression, I am well aware that the circumstances by which each of these groups became American are different. Nevertheless, these communities share the experience of becoming American by force, not by choice. Since 1999, when I founded the Center for Urban Education, my work has focused on making racial inequality in higher education public to practitioners, to leaders, policymakers, and scholars. My aim is to create awareness of the fine-grained details of racial inequality and build institutional capacity to institutionalize racial equity. I view racial equity as an essential quality of institutions of higher education, and I believe that practitioners and leaders need to develop the competence to perform racial equity routinely and conscientiously. An aspect of the work we carry at the center is to create tools to support critical racial analysis of existing policies and other kinds of artifacts that have been given the stature of master frameworks and carry the authority of best practices. Typically, these best practices are not best at all. They are not race conscious and do not consider that what may work as well for white students may be harmful to students of color or might perpetuate inequality. In the last couple of years, we have seen private foundations investing heavily in reforms to improve the delivery of remediation in English and mathematics, to increase the number of students who transfer successfully from community colleges to four-year colleges, and to improve efficiency by streamlining the curriculum into degree pathways to reduce the likelihood that students will take courses that lengthen the amount of time it takes to earn a degree. Alicia Dowd, along with many others, describes community colleges as gateways and gatekeepers of racial equity simultaneously. Our center works with many community colleges in California and Colorado, and we view remedial education and low transfer rates as major obstacles to racial equity. Consequently, we have examined a variety of documents, books, and reports on these reforms with three interpretive questions in mind. Is race visible in the document, and in what ways is it visible? Does the depiction of the problem and solutions reflect an understanding of the underlying causes that account for racial inequality? Will the recommended reform build a capacity of practitioners to produce racial justice in educational outcomes? These are simple, straightforward questions, and they're focused on answering one larger question. Who benefits and who might be harmed by reforms that do not acknowledge the social reality of minoritized students? The documents that we subjected to the 3 critical race questions include a document titled Core Principles for Transforming Remediation within a Comprehensive Student Success Strategy, published by a consortium of organizations, including, among others, Complete College America, American Association of Community Colleges, the Education Commission of the States, and other organizations. We also examined the transfer playbook published by the Community College Research Center at Teachers College and the Aspen Institute. We also examined various documents represented guided pathways, which is a popular reform that has attracted millions of dollars in foundation and government funding. These documents represent a set of trending solutions in education and are currently enjoying a great deal of momentum. I call these documents artifacts in the tradition of socio-historical activity theory, which posits that people carry out their work in activity settings and that artifacts, which can be documents as well as language, mediate practices. The set of artifacts we analyzed, these ones, were created with intent to mediate reforms, that is to say, that they provide advice on how to perform remedial education and transfer in ways that are more responsive to the needs of students and their success. From my perspective, transfer, remedial education, and curricular dysfunctions disproportionately impact Black Americans, Latinos and Latinas, American Indians, as well as Pacific Islanders. Therefore, it is important to ascertain whether these artifacts will actually rectify racial inequalities. To start, this set of artifacts make one important contribution in that they focus on what colleges need to do to improve the outcomes of students. The artifacts do not situate the problem in students' motivation or cultural background, as we often see, where the students are blamed for the inequalities that they experience. That said, though, from a critical race perspective, this set of artifacts are problematic for a variety of reasons. Race is conspicuously invisible in all of the documents. A word search using a variety of descriptors, including African American, Black, Latino, Hispanic, equity, inequity, race, racial, and others, essentially turned up the same result: no such term found. For example, the transfer playbook has no references to Black, Latinos, or American Indians, no reference to race or equity. Instead, race-neutral terms such as low income and first generation are used a couple of times. Also, the term demographic is used repeatedly, as in demographic forces. I am aware that when there is discomfort to talk about race, individuals may resort to euphemistic substitutes to mean race without saying it. But to not name race directly can create harm out of good intentions. In the transfer book, in the playbook, while race is not mentioned directly, community colleges are seen as a natural supply of diversity that can help four-year colleges meet diversity goals. The transfer playbook makes the point that most students entering a community college aim to earn a bachelor's degree. But then they goes on to say, but for a host of financial and quote-unquote other reasons, many are unlikely to transfer. While I agree that finances may be an impediment to transfer, I don't think it is the main impediment. Race and racism should be considered among those other reasons that block transfer. The emphasis of the transfer playbook is on articulation agreements, curricular maps, data, and specialized advisement. Procedures, structures, and practices are indeed important, and they need to work efficiently. But transfer is not an assembly line process that can be made to work with machine-like exactitude by tinkering with structures. Articulation agreements, curricular maps, data, specialized advisement, transfer centers will not change the outcomes for Latinos, African Americans, and American Indians and Pacific Islanders if practitioners fail to ask who benefits from these structural arrangements by race and ethnicity. How can we create structural reforms that are race conscious? The word data is mentioned over 45 times in the transfer playbook, yet the importance of disaggregating data by race and ethnicity to see who specifically is transferring and where are they transferring to is not mentioned. It matters a great deal to monitor whether Black and Latino and American Indian students are transferring to public and private colleges, or are they transferring to the for-profit sector? The document on the core principles of transforming remedial education presents the crises around remedial education as a problem of all students. While many students struggle with developmental education, the majority of students who are placed into and never complete remedial education sequences tend to be predominantly students of color. Therefore, the focus on all student solutions papers over race. The only nod to race in the transfer playbook is the photo of a student who is Black. She might be Black American, but she could also be international, or she could be Latina. Neither a single photo or many photos of diversity compensate for leaving race out of the body of the document. Like the transfer playbook, the core principles use words that I assume refer to Black, Latino, and American Indian students, but without specifically naming them. The most troubling aspect of the core principles to reform remediation is the implicit faith that different kinds of structures and sequences will create better outcomes. While I do not dispute the need for structural change, race is a significant factor in the crisis of remedial education, and one-size-fits-all structural changes that fail to take race seriously will only benefit minoritized students who have developed the coping strategies to succeed in alienating contexts. But the students who are placed in remedial courses often lack the know-how to overcome alienating instructors and classrooms. Another noticeable and regrettable oversight is in the core principles of transforming remedial education is the significance of instructors' beliefs, their pedagogical competence, and their capacity to understand the social reality of minoritized students. Changes to the organization of remedial education or to the methods of assessment and placement in remedial education courses will not induce instructors to discard the folk theories they call upon and through which they naturalize the failure of minoritized students. If a prevailing belief among remedial education instructors is that students from particular racial ethnic groups are doomed to failure and that there is little they can do to reverse the situation, it is doubtful that structural changes that are not race conscious will lead them to view inequity as a failure of their practices. Relatedly, but much more complicated, instructors lack the know-how to notice that the ways in which they interact with minoritized students can impose a self-worth tax. For example, syllabi full of rules seem to be common in community colleges. These rule-heavy syllabi suggest that instructors have low expectations of their students. They anticipate that students will violate rules, misbehave, and not act, as some syllabi put it, civilized. These syllabi list the many and different ways in which students risk failing or being asked to leave the class. A syllabus typically is an instructional artifact that lays out a plan for what will happen in a course, what students will be asked to do. It's a guide, it's a resource. It is also a medium through which the instructor communicates with students the value and joy of a particular topic. Instead, some instructors use syllabi as instruments of discipline and admonishment. The language of rules paints an image of students as disruptive rather than as learners. In the context of race, such messages are harmful to students' self-worth. For the sake of brevity, I have spoken only about the transfer playbook and touched lightly on the core principles for reforming remedial education. The literature on how to do pathways, which we also reviewed, leaves race out. The ideology reproduced through these documents is that race does not matter sufficiently to merit naming, analysis, or consideration of how transfer, remedial education, and degree attainment are in fact racialized. Scholars who leave race out, particularly when race is integral to the phenomena being considered, should take heed and counsel from Douglas Massey. Papering over race makes for bad social theory, bad research, and bad policy. In reviewing these documents, I was surprised about the consistent omission of race, and I wondered why. After all, the extent of racial inequality that has been created through the overrepresentation of Black, Latino, and American Indian students, and also Pacific Islanders in remedial education courses is well documented and it is well known. The fact that these students also continue to have the lowest transfer rates is also well documented and well known. So what is going on? How could it be that the social reality of these students is invisible in documents that aim to solve a racialized problem? Why is it that still, 54 years after the adoption of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, we're not able to engage in straight talk about how race and racism operate through the very structures that these documents aim to reform? Here are some explanations. Higher education is thought to be more liberal than other American institutions. It is possible that liberal ideology creates a false sense of confidence that in addressing all students, the interests and needs of minoritized students are included. It is possible that in positing transfer, remedial education, and guided pathways as a set of race-neutral practices, structures, and policies, the authors made a choice to appeal to universal interests, thinking that they would be more likely to get buy-in from practitioners and policymakers and leaders who don't want to talk about race or who complain about race fatigue or believe that we have gotten over race and racism. So why bring it up? It is possible that the authors of these documents feel that all students means all students, and there's no need to specify Black students, Latino students, white students. They believe that focusing on all students is fair and objective. Unfortunately, all students often ends up normalizing the experience of white students. When data are presented for all students, racialized outcomes are covered up. To help explain the problem with race-neutral discourses, I turn to Amy Gutman. In her essay, Responding to Racial Injustice, she makes the point that when well-meaning people believe that color blindness means racially just, they are assuming an ideal society that has gotten over racism. But we are very much a non-ideal society. We have very clearly not gotten over racism. Therefore, critical race consciousness is the only appropriate and necessary stance to address the consequences of practices that disproportionately deprive Black Americans, Latinos, American Indians, and Pacific Islanders of the kind of educational experience that the well-to-do feel entitled to. Do not consider the role of race and racism in transfer, remedial education, and in guided program pathways is to mistakenly assume that the community college is already just, and therefore race is no longer relevant. I don't think that the authors of these reports view the community college as the ideal model of educational justice. So what is going on? Why was race left out? It is possible that these authors understand racism as overt individual and interpersonal acts that are easily labeled as racist. But in the present day, the more sinister and insidious problem is structural racism that is produced through everyday practices that are carried out systematically. Structural racism is extremely challenging because most people do not see it, and those who do see it are often dismissed for seeing too much. A reform perspective on transfer that places so much faith in the structural design of transfer as the solution to low transfer rates and fails to direct practitioners, leaders, policymakers, intermediary organizations, and funders on how to examine these structures for racial bias and disproportionate impact on students of color runs the risk of effectively maintaining inequality. The extent to which structures will be effective, fair, and just for students of color who experience the lowest rates of transfer depends greatly in the beliefs, values, and knowledge of practitioners. Most practitioners do not think of racial inequality as an enduring characteristic of their institutions, and they are typically unaware of their implicit biases. They are not in the habit of asking, why is it that my practices, year after year, fail to create success for Black students, for Latino and Latina students, for American Indian students, for Pacific Islander students? I have described these artifact documents as master frameworks because they carry the authority of leaders in the community college agenda. They have the imprimatur of powerful funders, and they have a forum that enables them to influence what community college leaders and practitioners view as the right thing to do. Yet, these documents do not answer the question of what's going on, and they do not move us closer to making education just. So what we have is a scenario in which the leading voices of the community college fail to assert racial equity as a goal. They fail to view community colleges as racialized institutions, and they fail to perceive racial consequences of ostensibly race-neutral reforms. With these failures, they make the work of racial equity advocates even more challenging than it already is. In my article, The Underestimated Significance of Practitioner Knowledge in the Scholarship on Student Success, I speak about the problem of highly cohesive and homogeneous scholar networks. Drawing on the work of organization scholar Carl Weick, it is possible that the absence of race owes to the lack of variability in the conceptualization of transfer, remedial education, and degree pathways. Small scholarly and policy-making communities with close disciplinary and social ties may block the entry of critical race theories and perspectives. A review of the citations index of these artifact documents show no references to the works of scholars of color generally, and in particular to those who have a critical perspective. For example, the work of Professor Laura Rendon on validation theory, which is of great relevance to understand the experience and needs of students of color, is nowhere to be found. The work of Sylvia Hurtado and Deborah Carter on sense of belonging is also missing. The work of Tara Parker and Leticia Bustillos on remedial education is also missing. The work of Sean Harper on racial climates and high-achieving African-American males, also missing. The work of Victor Sanz and Luis Ponjuan on Latino males in community colleges, also missing. The many critical and race-centric studies on community college transfer written by Alicia Dowd and colleagues, also missing. So should we assume that they're missing because the creators of these artifact documents are entirely unaware of them? Or is it because they're not thought to be relevant? Or perhaps it's because their critical orientation makes them somehow suspect. Again, I have to ask, what is going on? I do know that the consequences of a tightly knit and homogeneous social network of scholars, policymakers, and leaders of intermediary organizations is that racialized problems, when viewed through ostensibly race-neutral frameworks, run the risk not only of perpetuating inequality, but worsening it. For example, there's already evidence that reforms of remedial education that are not monitored for racial effects actually increase racial gaps. This is in fact the case in Colorado, where we do a lot of work. In 1989, in a Chronicle of Higher Education article titled "An Elite Priesthood of White Males Dominates the Central Areas of Civil Rights Scholarship," Michael Olivas asked, why is it that when it comes to issues of civil rights, scholarship is dominated by white males who display a surprising pattern of self-citation? So here we are, 3 decades later, and I'm asking a similar question. How could it be that the body of knowledge informing reforms aimed at the sector that has been given the greatest responsibility for the attainment of racial equity systematically excludes the critical perspectives of scholars of color? I'm going to actually skip part of this because I know that you're probably tired and you are waiting to go into the reception so that you can also have drinks like the people who are watching us on the live streaming. So let me go here. Making higher education just requires research methods and reform agendas that will empower practitioners and will help them with the knowledge and the tools that are necessary to dismantle the everyday practices that produce racial inequality. Institutionalized racism is a problem of practice that is more productively understood locally rather than at the macro level. I chose the title, Making Higher Education Just, because I believe it is a message we can all unite behind. It calls for justice at a time in this country when justice is in rather short supply. And it reflects the aspirations in the mission of the Center for Urban Education and in the research methods we use to partner with individuals in California and many other states to remove the barriers to racial inequity. It is not simply, our work is on action research is not simply a theory or an idea, but a proven practice that fosters change and, yes, justice. The other theme running through my talk today related to music, to answering a question about what is going on in these times we're living in. But that is just one song out of many that I chose to play today for you. And in your seats, you had the lyrics for the many songs that we're playing. Besides representing artists who I enjoy listening to, the lyrics in those songs reflect other themes in my talk and in how I think about my work. Like, for instance, Hamilton's cast. I am making a case that scholars of color, like immigrants, get the job done when it comes to understanding racial inequity. And all you got to do is see the world through their eyes. Metaphorically, La Santa Cecilia's ice, water, frozen solid, is the wall that scholars and advocates of racial equity come up against when they bring up issues like the ones that I have brought up this afternoon. And of course, like Marvin Gaye, I have asked, what is going on? I wish I could sing it. I wish somebody could definitely tell me. Tell me why the people who are supposed to be leaders on this issue seem so blind to genuine positive change. Tell me why they leave race out. Tell me why they do not take heed from the scholars and advocates who struggle mightily to rectify racial wrongs. Tell me why the imprints of scholars of color are so plainly missing from the networks that aim to reform what scholars of color have been reforming always and forever. Given the many other things happening in education and in this country right now, I suspect that all of us will be asking what is going on for years to come. But maybe the answer to that question is in another related question that we can all ask ourselves just as often. What can I do to change what is going on? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bensimon. Please join us in Salon F for a reception honoring our awardee and our lecturer.
Thank you very much.